Power does not always come from palaces or political offices. Sometimes it rises from factories, from steel, sweat, and assembly lines. The Ford family did not rule a nation, they built one. Through machines, ambition, and an uncompromising vision, they transformed how the world worked, moved, and lived. This is not just the story of a car company. It is the story of industrial power, ideology, control, and legacy. You are listening to Sleepy Dynasties. This is the Ford family. When industry became destiny. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was still defining itself. The nation was vast but uneven, rich in resources, poor in structure. Cities were swelling with immigrants. Railroads stitched the continent together, yet daily life remained slow, labor-intensive, and uncertain. The promise of progress existed, but it had not yet been mechanized. Then came industry. Factories rose where fields once stood. Machines replaced muscle. Time itself was reorganized into shifts, schedules, and quotas. And at the center of this transformation stood a new kind of power, not inherited through bloodlines or elections, but forged through production. No family embodied this shift more completely than the Fords. Unlike political dynasties or financial empires built on speculation, the Ford legacy emerged from something tangible. You could see it, hear it, touch it. Steel frames, turning gears, endless rows of identical machines moving forward in perfect synchronization. The Ford story is not merely about innovation. It is about control of labor, of time, of society's rhythm. It is a story of idealism and authoritarianism existing side by side, that of generosity and rigidity, that of progress delivered at scale and at cost. Henry Ford believed he was improving humanity. His family inherited not only his fortune, but his contradictions. To understand the Ford family is to understand modern America itself, its efficiency, its inequalities, its obsession with growth, and its enduring faith in machines as solutions to human problems. This is the beginning of that story. Henry Ford and the invention of modern power. Henry Ford was not born into wealth, privilege, or influence. He entered the world in 1863 on a modest farm in Dearborn, Michigan, a place defined by soil, seasons, and repetition. His parents expected him to inherit the rhythms of agricultural life, but Henry felt constrained by it. Where others saw stability, he saw stagnation. From an early age, machines captivated him. He dismantled watches, repaired engines, and obsessed over motion, how parts interacted, how systems could be simplified, how effort could be reduced. To Henry Ford, machinery was not merely functional, it was philosophical. He believed that inefficiency was a moral failure. This belief would shape everything he built. In the late 19th century, automobiles were rare, unreliable luxuries, handcrafted for the wealthy, prone to breakdowns, and inaccessible to the average citizen. Ford saw this not as a technical limitation, but as a conceptual error. The problem was not the car, the problem was how it was made. In 1903, after multiple failed ventures, Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company. From the beginning, his vision was radical: to build a car that ordinary people could afford, operate, and repair. But affordability alone was not enough. Ford wanted ubiquity. He wanted cars everywhere. The breakthrough came not with the product, but with the process. In 1913, Ford introduced the moving assembly line, a system that would redefine industrial production forever. Each worker performed a single, repetitive task as the product moved continuously forward. Time was measured, motion optimized, and variation eliminated. Efficiency skyrocketed, costs plummeted, production exploded. The Model T became more than a vehicle, it became a symbol. a machine that democratized mobility while standardizing experience. You could own a car, but it would be exactly like everyone else's. Ford famously said customers could have the Model T in any color they wanted, so long as it was black. This was not a joke that IT was an ideology. Uniformity was efficiency, choice was waste. Yet Henry Ford understood something crucial about labor that many industrialists ignored. Workers were also consumers. In 1914, he shocked the business world by introducing the $5 workday, more than double the industry standard. It was hailed as generosity. It was also strategy. By paying workers enough to afford the very cars they built, Ford created a self-sustaining economic loop. Production fueled consumption. Consumption justified expansion. Expansion reinforced power. But this apparent benevolence came with strict control. Ford's factories were surveilled. Workers' private lives were scrutinized. Drinking, gambling, and perceived moral failings could cost a man his job. Efficiency extended beyond the factory floor. It entered the home. Henry Ford did not merely employ people that he attempted to engineer them. His worldview was rigid, moralistic, and deeply suspicious of dissent. He despised unions, resisted external influence, and believed that social harmony could be imposed through structure. These contradictions, progressive wages paired with authoritarian oversight, defined the Ford system. And they defined the family legacy that would follow. By the time Henry Ford became one of the richest and most powerful men in the world, his influence extended far beyond automobiles. He had reshaped labor, consumption, and the relationship between industry and everyday life. But power, once established, demands succession. And the question that loomed over the Ford empire was no longer how to build, but who would control what had been built. Succession, control, and the shadow of the founder. Power is easiest to build when it belongs to one man, and it becomes far more dangerous when it must be inherited. By the 1920s, Henry Ford was no longer merely an industrialist. He was an institution. His name stood not just for automobiles, but for a philosophy of life, efficiency, discipline, and an unshakable belief in his own moral clarity. Yet for all his control over machines and systems, Henry Ford struggled with the one mechanism he could never fully engineer: succession. The Ford empire was vast, profitable, and expanding, but it remained deeply personal. Unlike modern corporations governed by boards and shareholders, Ford Motor Company revolved around the will of its founder. Decisions flowed downward from Henry Ford alone. Loyalty was valued more than competence. Obedience more than innovation. This concentration of power created a paradox. The company was enormously successful, yet dangerously fragile. At the center of this fragility stood Henry Ford's only son, Edsel Ford. Edsel was everything his father was not. Where Henry was rigid, Edsel was refined. Where Henry distrusted aesthetics, Edsel valued design. He understood markets, consumer psychology, and international expansion in ways his father never cared to. Educated, diplomatic, and thoughtful, Edsel represented a modern vision of leadership. But he was trapped beneath the shadow of a titan. Though Edsel was named president of Ford Motor Company in 1919, his authority was largely symbolic. Henry Ford retained final control over every significant decision. He overruled his son publicly and privately, often dismissing Edsel's ideas as unnecessary or indulgent. The humiliation was constant. Edsel pushed for innovation, new models, better styling, and responsiveness to competition. Meanwhile, General Motors was rising rapidly, offering variety, color, and annual updates that appealed to a changing consumer base. Ford, anchored to Henry's philosophy, resisted change. For nearly 2 decades, the company stubbornly relied on the Model T, even as sales declined. Edsel saw the danger clearly. Henry refused to acknowledge it. This conflict was not merely strategic, it was psychological. Henry Ford viewed disagreement as betrayal. To him, deviation from the system was a moral failure. Edsel's modern instincts challenged not just business decisions, but Henry's identity. And Henry Ford did not yield. The strain took its toll. Henry Ford II and the reinvention of an empire. When Henry Ford II stepped into power, the empire he inherited was vast, but unstable. He was only 26 years old when his grandfather, Henry Ford, died in 1947. The company bearing the family name was one of the largest industrial enterprises on Earth, yet internally, it was adrift. Years of centralized control, paranoia, and resistance to modernization had hollowed out its leadership structure. Ford Motor Company was rich in assets, but poor in systems. Henry Ford II understood this immediately. Unlike his grandfather, he had no interest in myth or ideology. Unlike his father, he carried none of the burden of deference. He was pragmatic, impatient, and acutely aware that without radical change, the Ford empire would collapse under its own weight. His first challenge was legitimacy. Executives, many of whom had survived by appeasing the founder, doubted the competence of a young heir. The company culture was entrenched in fear and loyalty rather than accountability. Financial oversight was chaotic. In some cases, no one could say with certainty whether the company was profitable. Henry Ford II did not attempt to rule through charisma or legacy. He ruled through restructuring. One of his earliest and most consequential decisions was to invite outsiders into the heart of the company, a move that would have been unthinkable under his grandfather. He recruited a group of former U.S. Army Air Forces officers, men trained in logistics, systems analysis, and large-scale coordination during World War II. They would become known as the Whiz Kids. These men introduced modern management techniques to Ford Motor Company: statistical controls, standardized accounting, long-term planning, and performance-based evaluation. For the first time, decisions were driven by data rather than instinct. This was a quiet revolution. The shift was not merely operational, it was cultural. Power began to flow through processes instead of personalities. Departments were reorganized. Authority was clarified. Transparency replaced secrecy. Many long-serving executives resisted. Some were removed. Henry Ford II was unsentimental about it. He understood that survival required breaking with tradition, not preserving it. The results were swift and dramatic. Within a few years, Ford Motor Company returned to profitability and stability. The chaos of the final Henry Ford years gave way to a disciplined, modern corporation capable of competing with General Motors on equal footing. But Henry Ford II was not content with recovery alone. He wanted dominance. Under his leadership, Ford expanded aggressively into international markets, acquired luxury brands, and invested heavily in design and engineering. The company's identity evolved from utilitarian transportation to aspirational mobility. This transformation reached its symbolic peak in motorsport. Henry Ford II became obsessed with defeating Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, a race that represented not just engineering excellence, but prestige. After a failed attempt to acquire Ferrari, Ford committed to victory through competition. The result was the Ford GT40 program. In 1966, Ford achieved a historic 1-2-3 finish at Le Mans, decisively breaking Ferrari's dominance. It was more than a racing victory. It was a declaration. Ford was no longer a relic of early industrialism. It was a global, modern powerhouse. Yet, even as the company evolved, the family dynamic remained complex. Henry Ford II centralized authority around himself, though with far greater discipline than his grandfather. He valued competence but demanded loyalty. While he embraced professional management, ultimate power remained firmly in his hands. The Ford empire had changed, but it had not fully escaped the gravitational pull of its founder's legacy. Henry Ford II ruled during a period of immense transformation, post-war expansion, cultural upheaval, and the early signs of globalization. His leadership stabilized the company, restored its prestige, and ensured its survival. But the cost of this stability was distance. The Ford family began to withdraw from day-to-day operations, slowly transitioning from industrial operators to strategic overseers. Ownership remained, but control became more symbolic. The dynasty endured, but it evolved. By the end of Henry Ford II's era, the Ford family had accomplished something rare among dynasties. They survived their founder. Yet survival raised new questions. What happens when a family empire becomes too large to be personal, but too symbolic to be ordinary? And what role does a family play when the machine no longer needs its creators? Those questions would define the next generation of Fords. From operators to stewards, the quiet power of the Ford family. By the late 20th century, the Ford family no longer ran the company in the way Henry Ford once had. The era of the founder, where one man's will dictated every outcome, was gone. So too was the era of rescue and reinvention under Henry Ford II. What followed was something less dramatic, but far more difficult to sustain: continuity without command. The Ford family had become stewards rather than operators. This transition was neither sudden nor fully intentional. It emerged from necessity. Ford Motor Company had grown into a global corporation operating across dozens of countries, navigating complex supply chains, regulatory environments, and financial markets. No single family member, no matter how capable, could realistically manage such scale alone. Professional management was no longer optional. IT was essential. Yet unlike many founding families that diluted their influence over time, the Fords retained something critical: control. Through a dual-class share structure, the family preserved decisive voting power despite owning a minority of total equity. This arrangement allowed them to shape long-term strategy, appoint leadership, and protect the company from hostile takeovers, while remaining largely absent from daily operations. It was power without visibility. This model reflected a profound shift in how dynastic influence functioned in the modern era. The Ford family no longer needed to appear in factories or boardrooms to exert authority. Their influence was embedded in governance structures, bylaws, and institutional memory. The family name still mattered, but it no longer dominated. As Ford Motor Company navigated the turbulence of the late 20th century, oil crises, foreign competition, environmental regulation, the absence of a dominant family figure became both a strength and a weakness. Decisions were more balanced, more analytical, yet they sometimes lacked the bold clarity that had defined earlier eras. The company adapted, but cautiously. Internally, the Ford family faced its own challenges. Without a singular patriarchal figure, identity became diffuse. Family members pursued diverse paths: philanthropy, finance, arts, and public service, rather than direct industrial leadership. This diversification diluted internal conflict, but weakened cohesion. The Ford dynasty no longer revolved around a shared mission to build or run a company. Instead, it revolved around preservation of influence, values, and legacy. And preservation is a quieter ambition than conquest. Publicly, the Ford family cultivated an image of responsibility rather than dominance. Through institutions like the Ford Foundation, one of the world's largest private philanthropic organizations, the family channeled wealth into education, civil rights, public policy, and social justice. This philanthropic presence reframed the family's identity. They were no longer merely industrialists. They were custodians of a social vision. Yet this transformation was not without contradiction. The Ford Foundation, while born from family wealth, operated independently and often supported causes that conflicted with the company's labor practices or corporate priorities. The separation between family, foundation, and firm created a layered legacy, complex, sometimes contradictory, but resilient. In this period, the Ford family learned a critical lesson. Influence could survive without visibility, but relevance required adaptation. As globalization accelerated, Ford Motor Company faced intensifying competition from Japanese and European automakers, companies that emphasized quality, efficiency, and innovation. The American industrial model, once dominant, now had to compete on new terms. The family's role shifted again, from strategic guardian to cultural anchor. They became the stabilizing presence during moments of crisis, offering continuity when leadership changed and markets fluctuated. Their authority was invoked not to innovate, but to endure. This restraint marked a departure from the aggressive expansionism of earlier generations. It reflected an acceptance of limits, of scale, of control, of certainty. The Ford family had learned, through experience and loss, that permanence was not achieved through dominance alone. It was achieved through patience. But patience, when stretched too far, risks complacency. As the 21st century approached, the automotive industry stood on the brink of its greatest transformation since the invention of the assembly line. Environmental pressure, technological disruption, and shifting consumer expectations threatened the foundations of mass production itself. And once again, the question emerged: could a family built on machines adapt to a world redefining mobility? Crisis, conviction, and the fight for survival. At the dawn of the 21st century, Ford Motor Company appeared stable from the outside. Its name was iconic, its history unmatched, its presence global. Yet beneath this familiar surface, structural weaknesses were accumulating. Rising healthcare costs, declining market share in North America, and an aging product lineup eroded profitability year after year. The world Ford had helped create was changing faster than it could respond. Foreign automakers, particularly from Japan, had mastered lean production, quality control, and fuel efficiency. Consumers were shifting toward smaller, more reliable vehicles. Environmental concerns, once peripheral, were becoming central to public policy and market behavior. Ford was late to adapt. By the early 2000s, the company was hemorrhaging money. Losses mounted into the billions. Internal morale faltered. Externally, analysts began to question whether the American auto industry could survive at all. Then came the global financial crisis of 2008. As credit markets froze and consumer demand collapsed, Ford's competitors, General Motors and Chrysler, were forced to seek government bailouts to avoid bankruptcy. The very survival of American manufacturing was in doubt. Ford stood at the edge of the same abyss. But the Ford family made a defining decision. Years earlier, under CEO Alan Mulally, Ford had undertaken a controversial move, mortgaging nearly all of its assets, including the iconic blue oval logo, to secure a massive line of credit. At the time, the decision was widely criticized as reckless. In retrospect, it was visionary. When the crisis hit, Ford had liquidity. It did not require a government bailout. This distinction became a point of pride, not only for the company, but for the family that had supported the strategy. The Ford family's influence during this period was subtle but decisive. They backed long-term survival over short-term optics. They resisted political pressure, and they reaffirmed the importance of independence, even at enormous risk. This was stewardship at its most consequential. Ford emerged from the crisis bruised but intact. Its brand reputation improved relative to its rivals. The narrative shifted. Ford was the automaker that stood on its own. Yet survival did not equal victory. The crisis exposed deeper questions about identity. What did Ford stand for in a world moving away from internal combustion? Could a company defined by engines and assembly lines reimagine itself in an era of software and sustainability? The answers were uncertain. Internally, the Ford family faced a parallel reckoning. Their power structure, anchored in voting control rather than operational leadership, had proven effective in crisis. But it also raised concerns about accountability and adaptability. Critics argued that family control limited flexibility. Supporters countered that it enabled long-term thinking in an industry obsessed with quarterly results. The truth lay somewhere in between. The Ford family's greatest strength had always been patience. Their greatest risk was inertia. As the automotive world pivoted toward electrification, autonomy, and digital ecosystems, the Ford legacy faced its most profound test yet. This transformation would not be incremental. It would be existential. Once again, the question returned, not for the first time and not for the last. Could the descendants of the assembly line reinvent mobility for a world that no longer worshipped machines? The answer would define the future of the Ford family and determine whether their quiet power could endure another century. Electrification, reinvention, and the weight of the past. For more than a century, Ford Motor Company had been defined by one thing: the internal combustion engine. It was the heart of the company's identity, the foundation of its engineering culture, and the symbol of its industrial mastery. Generations of Ford workers and leaders understood cars as mechanical systems, machines to be refined, optimized, and produced at scale. But the 21st century demanded a different understanding of mobility. Climate change, regulatory pressure, and technological disruption converged to challenge the very premise of traditional automaking. Electric vehicles, once dismissed as impractical curiosities, began to reshape the competitive landscape. Software became as important as hardware. Data emerged as a strategic asset. For Ford, this was not merely a shift in products, that IT was a challenge to its soul. The Ford family watched as new players, unburdened by legacy, redefined the industry. Tesla did not just sell electric cars. It sold a vision of the future framed around technology, autonomy, and constant iteration. Its culture moved fast, broke conventions, and embraced risk. Ford, by contrast, carried the weight of history. Every decision was measured against a century of success. Every failure threatened not just profits, but identity. Reinvention required letting go of assumptions that had once guaranteed dominance. The family understood this tension deeply. While day-to-day leadership rested with professional executives, the Ford family's role as guardians of long-term direction became more critical than ever. They had to decide how much of the past to protect and how much to abandon. Electrification forced clarity. Ford committed billions to electric vehicle development, battery technology, and new manufacturing platforms. Iconic nameplates, once synonymous with gasoline power, were reimagined for the electric age. This was both bold and risky. The decision to electrify the Mustang brand exemplified this tension. For purists, it was sacrilege. For strategists, it was survival. The move signaled that Ford was willing to leverage its heritage not as a constraint, but as a bridge into the future. Yet transformation did not come easily. Internally, cultural resistance slowed progress. Engineering teams accustomed to mechanical mastery struggled to adapt to software-driven development cycles. Organizational silos hindered integration. The company's sheer scale made agility difficult. The Ford family, observing from its position of quiet authority, faced a familiar dilemma: intervene or trust the system. Direct involvement risked undermining professional management. Excessive restraint risked drift. The balance was delicate. As Ford expanded its investment in autonomy, connectivity, and digital services, it confronted another uncomfortable truth. The automotive business was no longer self-contained. Partnerships with technology firms, energy providers, and governments became essential. This interconnected future contrasted sharply with Henry Ford's original vision of self-sufficiency and control. Yet adaptation required humility. The Ford family's influence during this era manifested not through directives, but through endorsement. By backing long-term investments with uncertain returns, they signaled commitment to transformation, even when markets remained skeptical. This patience echoed earlier moments in Ford history: the assembly line, the $5 day, the post-war restructuring. Each had demanded faith in an unproven future. Electrification was no different. But the stakes were higher. Failure would not simply mean decline, it could mean irrelevance. As the industry accelerated toward a future defined by sustainability and intelligence, Ford stood at a crossroads. Its past provided resources, brand power, and experience. Its future demanded speed, openness, and reinvention. The Ford family, once architects of the industrial age, now confronted the challenge of becoming custodians of a post-industrial world. The question was no longer whether Ford could build cars. It was whether it could redefine what a car meant. Quiet authority, family power in a corporate world. In the modern era, the Ford family no longer commands attention through public leadership. There is no single Ford whose face defines the company, no patriarch whose words dominate headlines. And yet, behind the scenes, the family's influence remains decisive. It is exercised not through daily management, but through structure, through votes, governance, and long-term intent. This is power adapted to its time. At the heart of this authority lies the Ford family's control of Class B shares, which grant them disproportionate voting rights relative to their economic ownership. This arrangement ensures that strategic decisions, leadership appointments, mergers, and long-term direction cannot be made without family consent. Critics call it outdated, supporters call it stabilizing. For the Ford family, it is existential. In an industry subject to intense capital cycles, political pressure, and technological disruption, family voting control provides insulation from short-termism. It allows Ford Motor Company to pursue multi-decade strategies, electrification, software platforms, and manufacturing transformation, without capitulating to quarterly market anxieties. But this insulation comes with responsibility. Modern family members do not seek visibility. They appear rarely in public, speak cautiously, and avoid cultivating celebrity. Their legitimacy depends not on charisma, but on restraint. They must influence without interfering, guide without governing, preserve without freezing progress. This delicate balance defines their role. Internally, the Ford family operates less like a dynasty and more like an institution. Decision-making is formalized. Succession is planned. Emotional authority has been replaced by procedural legitimacy. This shift is not accidental. The family learned from its own history, particularly the dangers of founder dominance and unresolved succession. Quiet authority, though less dramatic, proved more sustainable. Yet even restrained power carries tension. Some shareholders argue that family control limits accountability. Others worry that legacy considerations slow innovation. These criticisms are not new, but they have gained urgency in an era where speed and adaptability define success. The Ford family responds not with rhetoric, but with patience. They rarely intervene publicly. When they do, it is measured. Their influence is most visible during moments of leadership transition, when continuity matters more than disruption. This was evident during recent executive changes, where the family prioritized stability, technological competence, and cultural renewal over bold personalities. In doing so, they reinforced a central truth. The Ford family no longer seeks to lead the company. It seeks to ensure it survives. Beyond the corporation, the family's identity has diversified. Members engage in philanthropy, environmental advocacy, education, and civic initiatives. These pursuits reflect an evolving understanding of legacy, one that extends beyond automobiles. They are not building factories, they are shaping values. This evolution mirrors a broader shift among industrial dynasties. Power today is less about command and more about alignment. Influence flows through networks, institutions, and long-term commitments. The Ford family has embraced this reality. Yet beneath this adaptation lies an unresolved question, one that history continues to pose to every dynasty that outlives its founders. When influence becomes invisible, does it remain meaningful? For now, the Ford family believes it does. Their authority, though quiet, still shapes the direction of one of the world's most enduring industrial enterprises. But the future will not judge them by control alone. It will judge them by relevance. Legacy, controversy, and the burden of memory. No dynasty that endures for more than a century escapes contradiction. For all its innovation and influence, the Ford family legacy carries shadows, moments where progress collided with prejudice, where power magnified error, and where silence became complicity. To understand the Ford dynasty honestly is to confront these tensions, not soften them. At the center of this reckoning stands Henry Ford himself. While celebrated as a pioneer of modern industry, Henry Ford also held views that cast a long and troubling shadow. In the 1920s, he used his personal newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, to publish a series of anti-Semitic articles that would later be compiled into a book distributed worldwide. These writings were not incidental, they were systematic, and they caused real harm. Ford's influence gave legitimacy to ideas rooted in fear and conspiracy. His words traveled far beyond Michigan, cited and admired by extremists abroad. Long after the presses stopped, the damage lingered, etched into history, impossible to ignore. The family would spend generations grappling with this legacy. Edsel Ford, deeply uncomfortable with his father's views, quietly worked to counterbalance them. He supported Jewish organizations, modern art, and cultural institutions that celebrated diversity and openness. Yet he never publicly confronted his father, a silence that reflected both filial constraint and the era's limitations. This pattern, private correction without public reckoning, would repeat itself. As Ford Motor Company expanded globally, it faced scrutiny for labor practices, environmental impact, and political entanglements. During World War II, Ford factories became engines of Allied production, helping to defeat fascism abroad. Yet the irony was inescapable. The company's founder had once voiced sympathies that aligned disturbingly close to the forces being fought. History, it seemed, refused to resolve neatly. In the decades that followed, the Ford family adopted a different approach to memory. Rather than defend the past, they chose distance. The family refrained from mythologizing Henry Ford as a moral figure. Instead, they allowed institutions, museums, historians, foundations to present a fuller, more complex narrative. This restraint was deliberate. They understood that legacy could not be preserved through denial. It had to be carried through acknowledgement. The Ford Foundation became central to this recalibration. Independent of the company and increasingly independent in mission, it invested heavily in civil rights, social justice, education, and democratic institutions. While not an explicit apology, the Foundation's work represented a counterweight to earlier failures, a redirection of power toward inclusion rather than exclusion. Critics argued this was insufficient. Supporters saw it as evolution. Both views contained truth. The Ford family learned that wealth amplifies values, but does not guarantee wisdom. That influence creates responsibility, but not immunity. And that memory, once shaped, cannot be undone, only recontextualized. In confronting its own past, the family faced a broader question confronting modern society. How should power be remembered when it has done both good and harm? There was no single answer. What emerged instead was a posture of humility, rare among dynasties forged in dominance. The Ford family did not seek to erase controversy, nor did they dwell within it. They acknowledged, absorbed, and moved forward, aware that silence could no longer be mistaken for neutrality. This chapter of reckoning reshaped how the family understood legacy. No longer as a monument to be protected, but as a responsibility to be carried, carefully, imperfectly, and in full view of history. And as the world entered an era increasingly defined by ethical scrutiny, transparency, and social accountability, the Ford dynasty faced its final transformation. Not from industry to technology, but from power to conscience. Ford in the American imagination. By the time the Ford family entered the 21st century, their power was no longer measured in output alone. The assembly line had long since ceased to be revolutionary. Automobiles were no longer symbols of freedom in the same way they once were. And yet, the name Ford continued to occupy a unique place in the American imagination. It evoked something deeper than a brand. Ford represented the moment when America learned how to make itself efficient. For generations, the Ford story was taught not as corporate history, but as national mythology. Henry Ford became shorthand for ingenuity, self-made success, and the promise that industry could elevate ordinary lives. His factories symbolized opportunity, especially for immigrants and working-class families seeking stability. At the same time, Ford also represented discipline. The regimented rhythm of factory life reshaped how Americans understood time, labor, and identity. Work became standardized. Productivity became virtue. The modern middle class emerged alongside this transformation. In this sense, Ford did not merely manufacture cars; it manufactured modernity. Culturally, the Ford name became embedded in language and thought. Fordism entered economic theory as a defining concept. The Model T entered museums as an artifact of social change. The company's influence extended into architecture, urban planning, and consumer behavior. Even criticism reinforced its presence. Labor movements defined themselves in opposition to Ford's anti-union stance. Environmental debates referenced Ford as emblematic of industrial excess. Each challenge affirmed the company's centrality to the American story. As decades passed, nostalgia softened the edges. The harsh realities of early factory life faded into memory, replaced by romanticized images of progress and unity. The contradictions remained, but they became part of a broader narrative about growth and maturity. For the Ford family, this cultural endurance was both an asset and a burden. Their name carried weight, expectation, and scrutiny. Every decision made by the company reverberated beyond balance sheets. When Ford succeeded, it symbolized American resilience. When it stumbled, it fueled anxieties about national decline. This symbolic role intensified in moments of crisis. During economic downturns, debates about Ford's survival became debates about America's industrial future. When Ford resisted government bailouts, it was framed not merely as corporate independence, but as moral resolve. These interpretations were often exaggerated, but they revealed something essential. The Ford family no longer controlled the company alone; they stewarded a symbol. In the digital age, this symbolic power faced erosion. Younger generations associated innovation with technology companies rather than manufacturers. Mobility became abstract. Rides, platforms, networks, rather than personal ownership. Yet Ford persisted in cultural memory precisely because it predated these abstractions. It reminded people of a time when progress was visible, mechanical, and tangible. A machine you could touch, a job you could see, a future you could drive. As America reckoned with inequality, automation, and climate anxiety, the Ford story resurfaced as a reference point, not as a blueprint, but as a mirror. What had industrialization given? What had it taken? In these questions, the Ford family's legacy remained relevant, not because it offered answers, but because it framed the debate. By shaping how Americans once understood work in progress, the Fords continued to influence how those ideas were reconsidered. Their presence in the national imagination was no longer commanding. It was reflective, and in reflection, power takes on a different form. Endurance, adaptation, and the meaning of legacy. The true measure of a dynasty is not how it begins, but how it endures. For the Ford family, endurance did not come from domination, spectacle, or constant reinvention of power. It came from adaptation, often reluctant, sometimes painful, but ultimately decisive. As the automotive industry moves deeper into the 21st century, Ford Motor Company no longer defines the future of mobility alone. It competes within an ecosystem shaped by technology firms, energy policy, global supply chains, and shifting social expectations. The certainty that once accompanied industrial scale has been replaced by volatility. In this environment, the Ford family's role is no longer to lead change, but to ensure survival through change. Their influence now operates at the level of philosophy rather than execution. They shape questions more than answers. They approve direction rather than dictate method. And in doing so, they embody a form of power that has become increasingly rare: patient authority. This patience has allowed Ford to make long-term bets on electrification, software integration, and new manufacturing paradigms that may take decades to fully mature. It has also allowed the company to retreat when necessary, shedding assumptions that no longer serve its future. The family understands that legacy is not preserved by imitation of the past. It is preserved by relevance. That understanding marks the final evolution of the Ford dynasty. From builders to controllers, from rescuers to stewards, from industrial architects to guardians of continuity, the family has gradually relinquished visibility without surrendering influence. They no longer seek to be remembered as innovators. They seek to remain consequential. This restraint may lack the drama of earlier eras, but it reflects a deeper wisdom forged through experience. The Ford family has witnessed firsthand the dangers of overreach, ideological rigidity, and unchecked authority. They have seen how quickly progress can become dogma. Their survival is not accidental. It is the result of learning when to step forward and when to step back. As mobility itself is redefined, the Ford family's greatest challenge lies not in technology, but in meaning. Can a dynasty born of machines contribute to a future increasingly shaped by systems, data, and ethics? Can industrial power coexist with environmental responsibility and social accountability? The family's answer remains evolving. But if history offers guidance, it suggests this: the Ford dynasty will not disappear quietly. It will adapt quietly, absorbing change, recalibrating influence, and remaining present long after louder powers have faded. Their future will not be revolutionary. It will be enduring. What the Ford family ultimately represents. The story of the Ford family is not merely a story of cars. It is a story of how power transforms when it survives its own success. Henry Ford believed machines could perfect society. His descendants learned that no system, mechanical or social, can eliminate contradiction. Progress always carries cost. Influence always demands responsibility. What distinguishes the Ford dynasty is not moral purity, nor uninterrupted triumph, but continuity through self-correction. They endured their founders' flaws. They survived internal conflict. They adapted to a world that outgrew the very industry they helped create. In doing so, they offer a quiet lesson about power in the modern age. Power no longer belongs solely to those who build fastest or command loudest. It belongs to those who can absorb scrutiny, accept limits, and remain relevant without insisting on control. The Ford family did not conquer destiny. They negotiated with it, again and again. And in that negotiation, they transformed from industrial rulers into custodians of a legacy larger than themselves. Their name no longer defines the future of mobility, but it still defines a chapter of human history, one in which industry reshaped society and a family learned, slowly, how to live with the consequences. That chapter is not closed. It is simply quieter now. Closing the Ford legacy. Power does not always end with collapse. Sometimes it fades into structure, memory, and quiet influence. The Ford family did not disappear. They evolved. From factories to boardrooms, from machines to meaning, their legacy continues, less visible, but still present. If this story made you reflect on power, progress, and endurance, consider subscribing to the channel. Because the Ford family is not the only dynasty that shaped America. Another family, another empire, another story waiting to be told.